Hi, this is Paul, and this is Rough Draft for Sunday. Now, as rough drafts go, this one is rough. I literally just stopped doing the PowerPoint 5 minutes ago, and as of 30 minutes ago, an hour ago, I had very little idea what this sermon was going to be like. So this is really, really rough, and that's a little bit dangerous because sometimes, I know myself, sometimes I often work on this stuff early in the morning. I've just been busy with conversations early in the morning that I haven't had a lot of early morning time to compose this week. And what that means is that sometimes when you write something for a first draft, at the end of it, you look at it the next day and you think, what was I thinking? Does this make any sense? Is this coherent? But it's Friday, and this week has been very busy, and so some weeks the sermon starts. I usually start working on the sermon on Tuesday. I usually give Monday a day off of sermon works. Tuesday I usually read over the text and do a little meditating on it. Wednesday I do my exegetical work. I do some more mulling over the text. I start to maybe think about some ways into the text. Thursday I'm looking for illustrations. I'm nailing down kind of the outline of my sermon, and ideally on Thursday I'll compose a PowerPoint. Friday I will do my rough draft here and talk through it again. Saturday, ideally, I don't think about my sermon at all, just kind of in the back of my mind. And Sunday morning early I get up and I polish it off, and Sunday morning at 11:30-ish or so, when it's about time for the sermon at Livingstone's, I give it. And that's my usual routine. And since December, when I started the Rough Draft for Sunday series, this has been kind of a good element of the series. So let's see how it goes. We'll see if I'm nuts. July 30, New York Times, Canada. I didn't know New York Times had editions for Canada, but apparently they do. And they had a very interesting article, When Churches Have Become Temples of Cheese, Fitness, and Eroticism. Now there's a title. Here's this church in Montreal that's been turned into a day spa, and it's quite clear that you have they preserve the windows of the church. And here's a church that is a weight room, and so it's a weight room. And then there's one church, this is the eroticism, the Cirque de Boudoir, where they take an old church and they play off of the nice, naughty thing. And obviously, if you're a Christian, you'll probably experience some real dissonance in this, because something in this might feel wrong or unholy or satanic, or for the group in particular, this is kinky and playful and ironic. But as you know, as a Christian, you look at this and at least I'm just deeply disturbed by it, because you take that which is holy, and well, that's especially when it comes to sexuality, because there's always this holiness, profane, top down, up bottom thing going on with it. And so then to do this kinky stuff intentionally in the context of a church, yeah. Is it just a building? Well, these new appropriations trade on the ghosts of Christendom and gain resonance and valence. Now, I'm just learning that I hear Jordan Peterson use this word valence in his lectures. It's like, valence. So I've had to figure out how to use this word psychologically. But that's what's going on in all of these things, that there's a degree, this is, we have difficulty articulating what this means and why these things feel the way they feel, and what's going on with them. Now, in my sermons, I've been going through the book of Kings, and one of the things that you might begin to realize is that towards the last couple hundred years of Judah's history, you have these huge swings. You had Ahaz as a bad king who's bringing in Asherah poles and bringing in idols into the temple and remodeling the temple so that it matches the the theological tastes of the king of Assyria. Then you have Hezekiah, who swings back towards Jewish nationalism, and all of those things come out of the temple, and the temple is purified, and all of the high places are put down, and worship is concentrated in the temple again. And then his son Manasseh swings back the other way, and these worships to astrology and pagan deities, and once again idols come into the temple, and children are being sacrificed outside of town, and then Ammon, his son, is assassinated, but the people of Jerusalem gang up on the people who assassinated him. And then Josiah, it swings back the other way far again, where there's very much seems to be these big swings going on in the kingdom of Judah. And the book of Kings, of course, evaluates the kings based on technically what we might call a Deuteronomist perspective. There are certain evaluations that the book of Kings has for these kings. Did they centralize worship at the temple? Did they get rid of the high places? Did they worship the Lord alone and not the Baals or Hadad or the gods of Assyria or the gods of the other kingdom? Did they attempt to apply the covenant, which is Deuteronomy, to the nation? Now, if you read through this, and let's say John Bright's A History of Israel, you'll notice that what John Bright tries to do is contextualize all of this in terms of the geopolitical issues of the day. Israel's evil kings submit to the rule of Assyria, and in many ways these kings don't have a lot of choice, because in the ancient world, to not bring in the gods of Assyria would be not showing allegiance. And this is an aspect of the ancient world that many of us are deeply disconnected with. And this was something that continued on, obviously, into the Roman period, that Christians were often suspect because they weren't paying allegiance to the cult of the emperor or the civic gods. This was, in ancient paganism, this was simply something you did as a citizen. And our ideas, especially those now past the Enlightenment, our conceptualization of religion and how it's tied into the rest of our lives is tremendously different from what it is for even other people who live in the Islamic world or the Eastern world or Latin America, where Catholicism, and even kind of the Catholicism that in some ways got combined with in Hispaniola and Haiti, some of the West African traditions, or some of the spiritual traditions that were in the Americas when the conquistadors came in. So this is a very complicated thing that's going on here. So this was part of their submission to Assyria and their allegiance. That was their religious practice. And so when you read a book like John Bright's, you begin to ask the question, well, does this then contextualize the story of the Bible? Was the goodness an accident of history? Now, what you see is that this isn't just about nationalism. What's happening is this very deep conflict between this similar but yet different practice of the Jews and the Jewish God, and their conceptualization of what this God wanted. And again, this is very complex to talk about theologically and historically, and I really have to boil it down here and, in a sense, not go there. But the practices of the nations were pretty clear. The polytheistic religious pluralism, which was actually in many ways a sort of consumerism. Because if you worship any and every god that seems to be meeting your needs or helping your political or economic aspirations to get what you want, at some point you have to pause and say, well, what really is your God? Is your God your appetites? Is your God yourself? Do you stand in the middle, and are all of these other gods your servants and slaves? And do you, in a sense, offer your allegiance to the God that can most give you what you want, depending on the fancy of the moment? And another thing that we see in this world, and Tom Holland in this conversation with N.T. Wright that was on Unbelievable, which was a terrific conversation, and I highly recommend that conversation. I don't probably have time for it in the sermon, but basically, if you stand at the heart of what you want, take what you want by any power you can employ, by physical, relational, or spiritual power that you can employ. And this in the ancient world meant offering children and slaves and captives as sacrifices to the gods. And when you begin to see that, you begin to understand the dramatic ways in which Christianity and its imago Dei and its reverence for human life kind of gets built into this humanism that we simply assume in the Western world. And so when you say, look at the current Western, even the secular humanist world versus the pagan world, this pulling your punches and not simply using whatever power in whatever form you have to take what you want. There's this respect for other people that is basically a consequence of the impact of Christianity in the culture. And it actually takes centuries for this to develop, but this is so prominent in our own moral system. And if you say, well, this isn't due to Christianity, well, compare it to the non-Christian world. And I'm not saying non-Christian world never had any respect for human life, but it's a very, very different situation. So things change. This is my grandmother when she graduated the 8th grade in the early 20th century, and I've got some wonderful stories. My grandmother was a storyteller. One of the stories that she tells us was she was attending Oakdale Park Christian Reformed Church in southeast Grand Rapids as a little girl, and one of the new technologies that came into play were flesh-colored stockings. And at that point, for a girl to go around without stockings would have been highly inappropriate. And so she shows up at church one day with flesh-colored stockings, and one of the elders stops her and basically says, "Young lady, what are you doing?" And my grandmother she was quite a feisty woman. I can imagine her little 6th grade or 8th grade self, stands up to that elder and says, "I'm wearing stockings. I'm wearing flesh-colored stockings." And you might imagine at the beginning of the 20th century that the question of colored stockings versus flesh-colored stockings and what was proper for a young lady to dress in. These were probably issues that were thought through in the church. What is moral? What is appropriate? What is good? What is right? Now, quite a bit later in her life, after my grandfather was a pastor, and as was the practice in the Christian Reformed Church, my grandfather worked in a whole variety of places. And when my grandfather felt that God was calling him to another church, he would go. And my grandmother hated this. And some of those places that she went, in fact, to the Canadian place that they served, she did not want to go to Canada. She really did not want to go. And she was quite unhappy there. And she actually built quite a bit of animosity against Canadians in those years. But because, again, of the role, she had nothing to say. So years later, when my sister was dating a Canadian, my grandmother had issues with this. "Oh, don't date a Canadian." And then when my to-be brother-in-law was entering the ministry, and my sister, kind of like her grandmother, who actually she takes a lot after, my sister was complaining about the types of places that her would-be husband, or at that time her current husband, might go and do ministry is. And my grandmother snapped at her, which was, well, uncharacteristic to do to the grandkids. She could snap quite a bit at her own children, as the stories are told, but she snapped at her. "A woman has nothing to say in the matter." And this is in the 80s, when the church was wrestling with this question of gender roles and should the woman always submit to the man, and how should these things go. And so even just in the course of my grandmother's life, all of these issues that are still present with us. What is appropriate for a woman to dress? What are gender roles? And the church is working through all of these questions, and you begin to realize that morality and identity are deeply connected. And the decisions we make are integral, not just for us in our own little lives, but for generations to come. And you, in a sense, see this played out in the story of Israel. And we wonder, how can we orient ourselves in time? What was right and what was wrong for Israel? We look back at child sacrifices, we say, "Oh, that was wrong." But many in a pluralist society would say, "Oh, but the Deuteronomist who's critiquing all these kings, or aren't they narrow theological? Why aren't they more open-minded about what God would want. And why would God care about whether or not you eat crayfish, or whether or not you marry someone from the same nation, or we have these questions about morality, but what these stories of Israel show, and what my grandmother's stories show, is that morality and identity are deeply tied. We see that in the current chatter about Trump. Why this man is unfit to be president because of his morality. Well, morality and identity, these things come deeply together. But we have the challenge. How can we orient ourselves in these things through time? Because especially in our current moment, Americans have this sense of, my moral compass is however I feel about something, and that which feels authentic to me is right, and that which feels inauthentic to me is wrong. Well, that's a nice idea, but is morality really that contextual? You don't have any problem, saying that people who own slaves based on skin color 200 years ago are morally deficient, and we should perhaps not honor Thomas Jefferson or George Washington because they were slave owners. So on one hand, you want to say, my morality is timeless, but on the other hand, all of your orientation of that morality is bound within time. And especially do you think that your emotional sense of morality is unconstructed? And this gets into the sense of the secret sacred self, that somehow if I have certain feelings, then that means that these certain feelings are spiritual and therefore eternal. And I, in this moment in 2018, stand in judgment and condemnation of all other cultures and all other people. And what we're essentially saying is, I am God. I often reference Christian Smith's book Soul Searching, where he comes up with moralistic therapeutic deism, and he wrote a few books on this, where he surveys American youth and discovers that American youth have this funny idea about moral knowledge. Americans think that their moral feelings offer a sort of moral knowledge, that, well, let your conscience be your guide. Well, but not if you're Donald Trump, or not if you're from another culture, or not if you're a warlord in Africa. So on one hand, they say, well, my moral feelings are sacrosanct. But then they flip around and say, well, you do you. Well, unless you do you impacts me doing me, or you're doing something wrong. And I begin to say, well, you're evil. And so then we have this imagination of this secret, sacred self, that somehow our true self is disconnected from history and deep down inside us. And we think, wow, that's who I really am. But on one hand, we want that morality to be objective and public, but on the other hand, we don't want to be governed by anybody else's moral feelings. And so we're lost in this idea of a lack of moral knowledge, but we play games, public and private, with respect to these things. And in many ways, what this means is that American ideas about morality are increasingly chaotic. Now, I want to tell the story about Josiah today. It's a rather famous one. Josiah was 8 years old when he became king, and he reigned in Jerusalem 31 years. His mother's name was Jedidah, daughter of Adiah, and she was from Bozkah. Now, obviously, when the book of Kings was written, remembering these names was important. He did what was right in the eyes of the Lord and followed completely the ways of his father David, who did not turn aside to the right or to the left. Hezekiah, the high priest, said to Shaphnah, they were remodeling the temple, I have found the book of the law in the temple of the Lord. Apparently, over the last generation of Manasseh, it was completely forgotten and ignored, and when they're cleaning out the temple, oh look, here's a copy. And he gave it to Shaphan, who read it. Then Shaphan, the secretary, informed the king, Hezekiah the priest gave me a book. You wonder what the priest was doing without the book before. Well, they were following probably some amalgamation of the practices of Assyria that had been remembered and passed on, because this is what we do. We watch what the previous generation does, and we just kind of do what seems right in the eyes of everyone around us. We're formed by our context. Hezekiah the priest has given me a book, and Shaphan read it in the presence of the king. Then the king heard the words of the book of the law, and he tore his robes. And he gave these orders to Hezekiah the priest. Ahikam, son of Shaphan, Akbor, son of Milkiah, Shaphan, the secretary, and Asaiah, the king's attendant. Go and inquire of the Lord for me and for the people and for all Judah about what is written in this book, and that what has been found. Great is the Lord's anger that burns against us, because those who have gone before us have not obeyed the words of the book. They have not acted in accordance with all that has written there concerning us. Then the priest and all of these people went and they found a prophet, because that's what you did, who was the wife of Shallum. It's clearly, by the time this book is written, these were people that were remembered in the minds of the readers. And so this book oriented, these names orient people in terms of the history of this book. And she lived in Jerusalem in the new quarter. She said to them, "This is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. Tell the man who sent you to me," that's the king, "this is what the Lord says. I am going to bring disaster on this place and its people according to everything written in the book the king of Judah has read. Because they have forsaken me and burned incense to other gods and aroused my anger by all the idols their hands have made, my anger will burn against this place and will not be quenched. Tell the king of Judah who sent you to inquire of the Lord, this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says concerning the words you heard, because your heart was responsive and you humbled yourself before the Lord when you heard what I have spoken against this place and its people, that they will become a curse and be laid waste, and because you tore your robes and wept in my presence, I also have heard you, declares the Lord. Therefore I will gather you to your ancestors, and you will be buried in peace. Your eyes will not see all the disaster I am going to bring on this place." So they took her answer back to the king. Then the king called together all the elders of Judah and Jerusalem, and they went up to the temple of the Lord with the people of Judah, the inhabitants of Jerusalem, the priests and the prophets, and all the people, from the least to the greatest. And they read in their hearing all the words of the book of the covenant, which had been found in the temple of the Lord. And the king stood by the pillar and renewed the covenant in the presence of the Lord, to follow the Lord and keep his commands, statutes, and decrees with all his heart and all his soul, thus confirming the words of the covenant written in the book. Then all the people pledged themselves to the covenant. And then after that, the chapter goes on to describe the purge, how they took down all the idols and all the practices, and they burned it and desecrated it, and this whole purge that happened. And this is something that had happened a few times in the book of Kings. Now, what are our takeaways from this? Is it karma? Do good things. So Josiah's reforms, Josiah is saved because of his reforms, but his reforms don't save Israel. And again, as we talked about before with the political situation, in some ways, Josiah, perhaps because of the weakness of Assyria and the strength of Egypt, or actually Babylon's coming in now, and there's three powers that are going, and Josiah himself will be killed trying to stop the Egyptians from going and allying with the Assyrians as they try to keep Babylon in submission. In other words, there's a whole geopolitical world that most people who are just reading the Bible don't have any perspective of, but that colors and highlights everything that's going on here. Is it karma? Jerusalem isn't saved. Is it cynicism? People do what is rewarded. There isn't truth, just expedience. Jerusalem will be crushed. But how is the story not crushed? We have stories from Sennacherib and from Assyria and Babylon and from Egypt. We have historical records of all of this, but when we read those, it's different. It's different. Where are the temples to Hadad, Baal, and Marduk? The empires of the world rise and fall and are forgotten. When's the last time you lost a night's sleep because you were afraid that Sennacherib and the Assyrian Empire were going to come and take all your possessions and steal the women and make them their slaves, and steal the children and make them their slaves, and kill all the men? You don't worry about Assyria. Those empires rise and fall and they're gone. Now, if you listen to the Sam Harris, Jordan Peterson debates, one of the things that comes up regularly is, oh, there's dogma, and it's these old books, and people are reading these old books, and how stupid is that? Well, here's the thing. For one thing, as you saw in my grandmother's story, religious people are always changing. The church in 2018 is different from the church in 1968, is different from the church in 1918, is different from the church in 1818. Is it better or worse? We say, well, it's better. Well, how do you judge? Is it better because it's more in alignment with what you think? You judge the book of Kings because it's in alignment with Deuteronomy, but you do exactly the same thing to the people in the past. You judge them according to your perspective. The difficulty we have is how can we orient ourselves? The problem we have is even as Americans, we orient ourselves in terms of what, the last decade or the community that I'm living around or the people that I want to aspire to become like. I mean, we are enormously shallow people, and I wouldn't be surprised if we are as easily forgotten as the worshipers of Baal, because we simply go along with what everyone else is doing. And the truth is, if you go back in history, who are the people that tend to get remembered? We have this bumper sticker that well-behaved women seldom make history. Well, well-behaved people seldom make history. And it's those who actually don't go along with the flow, but who over time get vindicated and validated that these are actually the people that shape history. But how do we live today? What's popular around me? I go with the flow. Well, that's pretty much a recipe for being insignificant and forgotten. If you want to be popular, there you have it. What you really need is a baseline. Well, that baseline has to come. It has to be a voice from another time, a voice from another place. And in fact, the older and the stranger, the better. Now you might say, well, why prioritize the Bible? We have lots of voices from ancient times. Well, fair enough. But you start someplace. The point there is that you need a dogma or you're just going to be part of the background noise. Now, how does this fit into the Christian story? Well, Jesus is Israel. Read the Gospel of Matthew. It's Judah's story. Jesus reenacts Judah's story. Judah is crushed but not destroyed. Jesus endures past the Roman Empire. Well, how? Well, Jesus transforms what it means to lose. You see, what happens to Judah, unlike the northern kingdom, is, in a sense, we have this going back and forth, and every time Judah capitulates to Assyrian pressure, she stops being Israel, true Israel. And so finally, when Israel, as a geopolitical entity in 586 BC gets destroyed, well, does Israel endure? Yes, it endures in Ezekiel, and it endures in the people that Jeremiah writes to and says, maintain your identity in the Lord, but seek the welfare of the city. How do you do that? We've never done that before. And so what happens is that she endures, but she's always got corruption and she always fails. So by the time we reach Jesus, they've kind of gotten the monotheism thing straight. And then the Christians start to worship Jesus, and well, then it really starts to change. You see, Jesus transforms what it means to lose. He triumphs, in a sense, like Judah, because he's crushed. And the sword loses its power. Jesus says, win by the sword, die by the sword. Well, you say, well, Jesus, what do you recommend? Die at the other end of the sword. Well, really? Well, that sounds crazy. But when we see Jesus, this Son of Man is reigning over an eternal kingdom. Well, you say, well, you only believe in the resurrection. Yeah, but here's the funny thing. He's reigning, and he's been reigning over human history for 2,000 years, and he continues to spread in Africa and Asia. What's going on? It's in fact his losing by which he wins. Now, what does that mean for us? Well, here's the thing. What do we think about my grandmother's stories about flesh-colored stockings versus white stockings like she's wearing in this picture? Well, you might say, those people then. But wearing clothing and what you wear still matters today. It's just in different senses. And we may not think anything about weaving linen and different kinds of fabric together, which is prohibited in the Levitical law. But so there's change going on, but the conversations stay with us. And The fact that the gym wouldn't take out the church windows tells a story. And what this means is that somehow deep in us we know we need to be oriented in a far larger story. We know if you're out in the middle of a boat for thousands of years, they never left sight of shore because they needed shore for orientation until they could begin to use the stars and until they had a compass, and then they could begin navigating out into open water. But what is your navigation? Do you fear the power of the now? You should. You are socially constructed. You are in a wash of public opinion. You are working on these hierarchies that are pulling on you, and you want to move up in them, and you're orienting yourself by a tiny slice of the world. And you say, well, pluralism is great. But isn't that just what the spirit of the age is telling you? Or depending on what context, are you more than just sociology of knowledge? Are you trying to orient yourself beyond the knowledge of one lifetime, of one civilization, of one century? How can you orient yourself in a noisy, pluralistic age? Now, again, this might all go by Sunday, I don't know. But what was interesting to me is I thought of Jordan Peterson at the end of this. And because, in a sense, these crazy biblical lectures that all of the deep Jordan Peterson fans are really waiting on, in some sense, the Jordan Peterson story is he found this book in the ruins of the temple, and he pulled it out, and he's not done processing yet. He's, in a sense, he's rending his clothes and saying, he's a John the Baptist figure. We're failing to orient ourselves properly, and we should read this book if we want to learn something. And now Peterson himself is on his own journey, and how will he land? How will he orient himself? Will his own story navigate? Knowing, and he's a prophet of disaster in many ways, knowing that disaster will come, struggling to respond in faithful gratitude to the covenant that we've broken. Well, got an idea for a new slide. Very rough draft. Are you afraid of dogmas? Are you afraid of things that don't change? Or do you actually want to orient yourself in something outside of the bubble of consciousness and the cloud of the now community in which you once lived? In the night Jesus was betrayed, he took bread and he broke this. And he said, "This is my body broken for you. Whenever you eat this, do this in remembrance of me." Word and sacrament in our tradition are the things that tether us. They tether us through time. They give us a community. They orient us. And even in the midst of all the changes that we are unable to fully evaluate or decide the morality upon, this thing gives us identity. Now, we're also saved by grace, which means that I'm getting lots of things wrong. And you might look at this sermon or look at my other sermons or look at my videos and say, look at all the stuff Vanderklay's getting wrong. Yeah, that's true. But how do I find my orientation? How do I find my center? How do I find my identity, my morality, and my community? Do this in remembrance of me.